You're listening to the Overfunctioning Podcast, learning leadership concepts through life experiences. Hello, friends. Welcome to another Overfunctioning Podcast. I'm Alex.
John.
Zach.
And we are pumped to talk to you today about anxiety. But before we get there, we are going to review our last podcast and actually a chat session that I had with Kent Boyd. So last podcast, gentlemen, we were talking about what is leadership, and that is the question I posed to you.
Well, I think last week we talked about leadership is about influence, and that individuals who lead well lead from strength, and through thinking carefully through principles and what they believe and what they're about over time, they develop a presence about themselves and ultimately increasing their influence. So thinking about that focus not on others, oftentimes in leadership you think about what do others want and what do they need, and there's times to consider that, but what we would posit is that in leadership, focusing on self and development of self is really a place to start.
Another thing that we talked about was the complexity of the systems that we're a part of, right? It all starts with the family, and that's a great place to start when thinking about leadership, because you had a mother, you had a father, we've all had that, but just how complex those systems are, how much tension is in there, how much anxiety can be a part of those systems, and then thinking that society is built about people who are in families, and just the way that that flows up and back down leads to very complex systems.
Very succinct. And I also, if you have not noticed as you're listening, we are outside once again, and the cicadas are also giving their input this evening. After their, 16 years of crawled back out. Left their little shellies on the park. Anyways. All right. So, in addition, that was just a little side note for you. It's giving me anxiety, actually. But the review of Kent Boyd. Kent Boyd is a head football coach at Kenmore Garfield High School and father, husband, awesome guy, and he talked to me mostly about transformational leadership. Anything that you guys pulled out of that that's a good thing that you were listening to, and something that
I definitely listened to that podcast.
Good for you.
But just the way that he talked about, again, going back relationally, just the complexities of dealing with students, but also managing their parents and other expectations of that, and how expectation management is a big part of dealing with people and with leadership.
You know, one of the things that struck me just about the position that Kemp finds himself in is you talked about the complexity of systems, of bringing together two different schools, two different football teams that have had a long tradition of the way things are done, and merging those two systems together is not an easy task, for sure. And one of the things I like that Kemp said is he talked about making decisions based on principle of what's the right thing to do. And when you are a leader of a football team or a family or any other type of system, there's going to be times where decisions are made. I think we have paratroopers coming in. But anytime you have a system that comes together where you're going to have a degree of anxiety that's going to be there, leading well in the midst of that can be really, really challenging. And as a leader, if you haven't thought of your principles and what you stand for, you're going to be pulling this way and then pulled that way, and it's going to be really, really challenging. So I liked what he said about principle-led leadership.
Yeah, I wrote a few things down, and what you said, what I stand for. At one point he talked about, this is what I stand for, and so do you. Like, he had to get everybody else on the same page. He's like, I stand for this, and if you don't stand for this, that's okay, but we're not going to work well together. So he mentioned that. And then another thing he stated was, before you became a leader, I guess, it was all about growing yourself. And then as you become a leader, it's all about growing others. And I thought that was interesting. And we're going to talk a lot about becoming a better leader yourself. And there's a mesh of about two of those different types of things. But in his context, he was talking about transformational, as in he talked about transactional. And so as a leader, you're transactional. I'm doing everything to see what I can get out of it. And then as you become a leader, become transformational. What can I help other people do? So those are just some highlights. So if you didn't listen to that, that is posted up on iTunes. So give that a quick listen, and I think you'll enjoy it. Mm-hmm. And now for the Taste de Resistance, the thing that I have been so excited to talk about, which is, I think, for some, may be like, this is ridiculous. Why are you so excited to talk about anxiety? But I'm ready for an anxiety sandwich of goodness in talking about this. So, to open up with, we should probably state some sort of definition or what we think anxiety is. So, what do you guys think? What is anxiety? What kind of definitions can we put on board with anxiety?
One of the interesting things that I noticed when we put up the post on the Facebook page about anxiety is how few responses we got about anxiety.
No.
So it's something that we all experience, but a lot of people just don't like to talk about it for a variety of reasons. But I think being able to think through anxiety carefully can be really helpful to lead well. So when I think of anxiety, I think of the two major categories of anxiety. Mm-hmm. There's acute anxiety and chronic anxiety. So it might be helpful to define those two terms separately. Starting with acute anxiety. Acute anxiety is kind of the fear of what is. It's something that is immediately a danger. So you might be familiar with the fight or flight response that happens because of an event that is right at the forefront. And acute anxiety is ultimately about the fear of what is currently happening. And our body is hardwired to react, to not respond thoughtfully during those time periods, and it's really something that's helpful in that sense. And then I contrast it with chronic anxiety, which is more of the fear of what if. So acute anxiety is the fear of what is. It's something present, something temporary. Chronic anxiety is more of the fear of what if, and it's something that just doesn't seem to go away. It's this ever-present unease. It's almost something that's hard to put a finger on about where it comes from, but it's just ever-present in there. And systems, you mentioned the complexity of systems. Every system has some essence of chronic anxiety. And the more that anxiety is strong, in other words, the more chronically anxious the system is, the more likely that a particular event is going to set in motion. Who knows what it's going to look like, but it's going to be some type of reaction that's going to be very, very obvious. So acute anxiety, fear of what is; chronic anxiety, the fear of what may be coming. So that's how I think about the issue.
Yeah, to bring it down a level to, bring life experience into this. One of the things that I see a lot, I've started to classify things as acute and chronic, just like in the way that I look at things. Mm-hmm. But one of the big indicators is what people complain about, because I think stress is a word that people use a lot, and the things that stress people out are typically chronic anxiety, I would say. Would you guys agree with that? Mm-hmm. And so when I hear people complaining and I hear people saying, well, this is bothering me, and I ask them, well, why won't you just address this? They bring up this whole what if. Mm-hmm. What if I do this? What if I do that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think the idea of what you shared about what I'm stressed about, what worries me, sometimes people can name that, but the reaction of that, the intensity of the reaction of that, the worry about why is this such a big deal to you, oftentimes suggests a high level of chronic anxiety that makes whatever that particular issue is more pronounced, more intractable, and more challenging for individuals. So in my work with leaders, one of the goals I have with them is whatever system they're leading, to be able to lower that chronic anxiety, which allows for more flexibility and dealing with whatever challenges may be coming.
Yeah, I had a discussion with a couple friends of mine about anxiety. And they basically asked me if anxiety was fear. And how would you guys respond to that?
Well, I go back to what if. So that what if question is the fear of the future, the fear of the unknown. So I know I would say from my perspective that fear plays into that.
Mm-hmm.
So I can think of an individual who wanted to purchase a gun for his house to protect his family. And he said, what happens if somebody breaks in my home and tries to kill my family? And I was thinking, they didn't live in a particular dangerous part of town, but I thought, what's the chances of that happening? And I think it's pretty small. But from my observation in society, we are a society that's very fearful.
Mm-hmm.
And I think to see an example of that is we cling to safety. I mean, you look at what people, I think about risk versus safety, and we are, I think, a risk-averse society where safety, look at car commercials. A big selling feature in car commercials, besides the technology of the car, is the 10, 12 airbags to protect you. So I see a lot of protection built in. I see a lot of protection built in parenting, where the fear of what if happened, what if my child gets abducted. And I was talking with an individual that's a parent in our community, and I talked about the safe routes to schools and the sidewalks that were built in. And this person asked me, do you think it's safe for students to walk to school today in our community? And I said, well, nothing's absolute safe, but sure. But they were not sure they wanted their kids walking to school for the fear of being abducted. And so I think this outsized fear of being unable to separate actual threats from perceived threats is a hallmark of an anxious society, which is based in fear. So I'd say so, yeah.
Yeah, and I was thinking about this today too. Like, anxiety is going to breed comfort. And we're gonna talk more about uncomfortability for sure in the future. But all three of us sit here and say we don't like being uncomfortable. I don't think anybody really likes being uncomfortable, but that doesn't mean it doesn't need to happen. And so in a chronic system, there's going to be a want to go towards comfortability. I wrote a few things down I was reading through Failure of Nerve by Ed Friedman, and a couple things that he had. He said chronic anxiety is destructive and withering. It is reptilian, which I find interesting. So reptilian brains, they lack a forebrain, and so that means they can't feel things. But it's very black and white, and so we can go down that road if you like. It's a want for good feelings, but not progress. Which, man, we could have a whole discussion just about good feelings versus progress, especially in the world we live in with social justice, which is a big topic right now, civil rights and all that stuff. With chronic anxiety, when it's heightened, it features no leaders. It's really hard to be a leader in a really strong chronic anxietal system. And the chronic system defines the emotional unit. And so there's a lot to process through there, but as far as going forward, maybe we focus in on about how it defines that emotional unit. So how does anxiety define, or specifically when we're talking about chronic anxiety, how does it identify, or how does it define that emotional unit, would you guys say?
Well, the first thought that comes to my head is I remember reading through Resilient Leadership, and one of the points there is Alex made this point where leaders are absent from systems with chronic anxiety that's present. And I remember a lot of, I think, resilient leadership and this Bowen's theory that's projected into the concept of leadership is very intuitive once you read it, and counterintuitive in other regards. But you read it and you think, that kind of makes sense. Mm-hmm. But one of the things that struck me odd was John was presenting this idea that people are comfortable with a certain level of anxiety. And so if you introduce a good leader in the system, one who has a solid sense of their values, of their identity, of where their direction is, where they're going, and they actually bring the anxiety down. On some level, that causes uncomfortability because people aren't used to that lack of anxiety, and that actually can cause anxiety as people rebel against the leader. And resilient leadership lays out many different ways. But do you want to talk on that, John?
Yeah, I just think about, so you mentioned in our last podcast about a self-differentiated leader. And we'll talk about self-differentiation, I think, in a separate podcast. But a leader who thinks clearly about what they believe is right and what they're about as a leader, certainly staying connected to others and hearing their input. But as a leader becomes more self-differentiated, as they exert more leadership into a system, it's likely that they're going to be criticized. So a highly anxious system, but maybe more specifically, individuals who are highly anxious, tend to view a self-differentiated leader with nagging suspicion. And there's going to be resistance on the part. And I gave a talk last week to a group of leaders in a neighboring business. And I spoke to them and I said, as you become more self-differentiated, I'm doing some work with them in helping them develop as leaders. And I said to them, as you become more self-differentiated as a leader, you can expect resistance. It will come if you're doing the proper job. And it actually may be a window into the fact that you're actually helping the system mature by going through a painful acute phase. Friedman talks about in Failure of Nerve that, and the actual title of that book, Failure of Nerve, which by the way I'll show it here. This is the Failure of Nerve book that Alex was talking about. This is my favorite leadership book. I really enjoy it. But the title of this book, Failure of Nerve, is all about that, what I just shared. The idea is that leaders who take their organizations through an acute, painful phase, where things that have kind of lied below the surface are suddenly brought out in the open, people don't want to deal with that. They'd rather keep it in the chronic phase they're used to, as you mentioned. They're comfortable with, if you will, even though it's something that is a kind of a knot in their side, but they're just used to it. And to bring it to the surface and make it more acute, the system will kick back and want the leader to get back to the way the homeostasis was before with this chronic anxiety. And most leaders cannot continue to stomach the resistance from their followers. And they have a failure of nerve, and they just go back to the way the system was before. Everybody seems to be happy and content. The initiatives are kind of pushed to the side, and the status quo returns, and everybody breathes a sigh of relief. But the system is immature and will stay immature until a leader can stomach that, and a lot of individuals cannot do that.
No. So as far as definition goes, which we were on for a while, acute and chronic, and what we're going to talk about is chronic. So the acute is biological. Now, I would also say that the chronic is biological as well. The standpoint of we're human beings, and so everything's biology, right? So as we go into this leadership, how does anxiety fill the leadership role, and what does that look like? Anxiety, I would say, is the fundamental piece that we're going to be talking about through every single one of the podcasts we talk about, every system that we've ever been a part of. Anxiety is going to drive how the leadership goes there, and it is foundational to understand the anxiety within that system, so that way you can better be resilient, and you can be tolerant, and you can help change that system. And so we're not talking about enduring. So if you are in a system that has chronic anxiety, it's not enduring the chronic anxiety. We're good at that because that is comfortable. And so I'll just sit here and I'll endure this. But when it comes to leadership, it's about being resilient towards it, having tolerance towards it, but then also wanting to change that. And that's when we go from a chronic and making that acute anxiety. And there is pain in that, and it is hard in that, and it's very uncomfortable. But in order to change something, you're going to have to make it acute. So, how do you do that?
I want to jump back to this whole fear of what if and this fear of what is. And so, what if being chronic and what is being acute. a lot of people are afraid to put themselves in the situation where the unknown becomes known.
Mm-hmm.
And so they'll stay in this chronic anxiety, and they'll bear with it. They'll shoulder that, like we've been talking about. And I think one of the great frameworks that is provided by this whole family theory system, when you look at society and you look at individual people and the way that they're relating and how anxiety is balanced and all this, it gives you this framework that helps you lower your own anxiety a little bit, because it gives you a way to process the information coming in. And what I mean by that is, when I look at acute versus chronic anxiety now, I know that when I personally am in a state of chronic anxiousness, I know that I am also in a position to frame that what is. I'm in a state of what if. And I can, let's say I'm having a conversation with Alex about something that's been bothering us. I have the ability to set the time and the place of that conversation, of the way to maybe confront him. And that's what you see a lot of leadership models talking about, is just good conflict management. And so much of that is wrapped up in this concept.
We talked earlier today about fables and making this real about anxiety and systems and what it looks like. And you talked earlier in the day about your sister and just the challenges that you've had. I think it would be helpful for the viewers to hear kind of that story and the anxiety piece of that.
Yeah.
And how that's played out. I think it's you talk about a case study of anxiety in the system. I think that's a great one. So if you wouldn't mind.
Yeah. Do you want me to start at the beginning of my life, or do you want to start where, this is, it kind of.
How many years is this span?
33.
Yeah.
33.
Well, I think it'd be helpful to talk about Brooke and the role she had in her family.
Yeah.
And then at her passing, one of the things about systems that we'll talk about is that everybody has a role they play in a system.
Yeah.
And when someone in that role goes away, there's a divorce, there's a death, there's a separation of some type, the system is going to force someone or push someone to take that role that someone previously had. And I think your story really illustrates that. So that might be a good way to frame that.
Yeah, so Brooke, I would say she's the most influential person in my life. Throughout her life was the stable person. So if you had anxiety, you could go to her, and she was always joyous and happy. And so, and didn't, I don't say she absorbed your anxiety, but made you forget about your chronic anxiety.
So age difference between the two of you, that would be helpful.
Yeah, she was 3 years older than me, but she also had a disability. Now, I don't know how much that plays into it. I think it does at some points, because it made her life and the way she thought about things very simplistic. Now, I don't mean that in the sense of like dumb at any sense or meaning. And if you are one who follows Christianity, or maybe you just agree with different parts about Christianity, you're not a follower. Christ talked about being simple like children and encouraging us to do that. And so the influence of my sister on me was this one of simplistic thinking. And that meant that she did not have this overarching chronic anxiety. So, I could go to her and she could absorb the things that I had chronic anxiety about. And I didn't have to worry about those things. She didn't bring them up. Like, we didn't talk about different chronic anxieties. She never complained. She did complain, but there's no criticism on other people's parts. She wasn't condemning people, and that brings a lot of anxiety. We're talking about gossiping here. And so that's the role that she had. And so when she passed away, that role was gone. And so obviously anybody who's ever lost anybody, that's a really difficult time, and that's acute anxiety right there. That's acute anxiety. This hurts. What are we going to do? And so within that moment when she passed away, and the days and weeks that went on, I consciously decided that I needed to fit that role that she had. And so I did that. And it was not easy. And it has taken me some time, in the last, I would say, and you guys have known me for a while now, it's taken me a long time to get out of that role and back into a role that I feel comfortable with, in which there's less chronic anxiety overall. And that is, it's been a blessing. Like, it's been so good from the standpoint of becoming more self-differentiated and falling into a role that I desire. Now, look, these thoughts are very fresh in my mind from counseling and talking to people. Like, I've just have been now realizing that I'm not really filling the role. I wasn't filling the role that I most desired in my life. And there's something to be said about filling the role that you desire or filling the roles that other people desire of you. And that's a hard thing to learn, especially for me. I'm a people pleaser, and I come from a family of fusion and, anxiety. We get together and get real close. But as I have become more self-differentiated, I've started to identify the role that I want. And so since I've been doing that, guess what happened in my family system? Other people have become more self-differentiated. My mother and my father, there was, I think, maybe 5 or 6 months ago, like, they would ask me, hey, every Sunday we're going to have a family, dinner. And I was, vehemently against it. Because there was just this, I felt like I was, and this wasn't even about them, it was about me trying to fit this role that I've always fit of, peacemaker and trying to be there for everybody all the time. As I've slowly pushed myself away from that, I've been able to, want to be with them now. I'll text my mom, and I'll be like, hey, what are we doing this week? When are we going to get food? There's just this aura of chronic anxiety because every time I went, I felt like I had to put on this mask to fill this role that they weren't even asking for. I put that expectation on myself because that's what I thought they wanted. And since I've gone away from that, our family system has become a lot stronger. And the things that I've desired out of my parents and desired out of myself is actually increased. And I've seen those things. And so it has been incredible. So that's just one story that I have about identifying your roles and, becoming more self-differentiated. But this isn't all of a sudden. This has been years.
It's a journey.
Yeah. And, when this happened, when my sister passed away, I was 19 years old. I'm 33, and there's different time frames for different people, but stay connected with people. Stay connected within that, even though anxiety is running rampant. If you stay connected, you have influence. And it shows you care and you love people. So
I think that really was a helpful illustration. And, you mentioned this idea of this is the role that, your mom and dad, family dinners, infringed upon you. And that's the, that scarf model, that's the autonomy piece.
Yeah.
To where you have to decide on your own, this is what I want to do. And yeah, I'm ready to do this. I want to do this. And this is one of the things I struggle with in leadership a little bit is this notion of caring for others and wanting to understand what others want and servant leadership. And I think there's a place for that. But oftentimes there's a slippery slope to get there where now I'm doing what everybody else wants and expects. And it sounds selfish, but Friedman talks about a solid self as someone who says, this is the way I'm going. The Explorers is a good example of that. And this is what we're going to do. And
and he has a list. He has a list of 4 things: characteristics of chronic families or systems. 1, reactivity, which we've already talked about. Very reactive. We'll have another topic, and we'll talk about automatic functioning, because that's a whole topic in itself. Any thoughts on reactivity?
Well, I was going to talk about Charlottesville a little bit, from Saturday. So I think that would be helpful to talk about reactivity. Where's that come from?
Yeah.
To drive a car into a crowd of human beings, how does one get there?
Yeah.
That really is curious to me, and I think the media has missed that completely on both sides of, chronically anxious societies, reactivity, hurting. Okay, hurting is part of that.
Blame displacement.
Blame displacement. It's other people's fault. And
a quick fix mentality.
Quick fix mentality. We need to pass legislation. We need to do this. We need to have this bill passed. And the problems perpetuate. They continually stay. And so the question is, why is that? And it's because chronically anxious systems do not respond to legislation. They simply don't. So the question then is, where do you go from that? So this is how I'm thinking about the direction of this next.
Just something I want to interject into here that I think is very helpful for thinking about these issues is these are presented as spectrums in the, if we want to call it literature, right? But it's not nearly as intimidating as that. But we have the spectrum of solid self and non-solid self, right? And we have the spectrum of we've talked about fusion and separation and just the way that we all have these natural places on these spectrums, and we'll float sometimes, but it's in times of anxiety, right, that we'll push outside of into these extremes, and you look at just the people's reaction, right? They react to an extreme, and I think it's interesting to take that, and we're talking about this concept of solid self, to see how we react in these times of heightened anxiety, and to see how we are deviating from our norm. An example being, we're raised in a family. This is an example provided by Resilient Leadership. As we're raised in a family, and the way that we respond to conflict is largely influenced by how our parents responded to conflict.
Yeah.
Do we go to a different room until we calm down, and cutting off that connection, increase our separation, or do we fuse? Do we fight? Do we argue? Do we have that large amount of conflict? And we talk about reactivity, and I don't know, how would you say that interrelates to all of these spectrums per se?
Well, the highly anxious system is going to, so the more anxious a system is, so let's take a system that's relatively non-anxious. Your least differentiated person is going to go wacko, even in that relatively calm environment. But as you ratchet up the anxiety, your marginal self-differentiated person is going to fall off the wagon. And eventually, we're not being taped here, are we?
Yeah.
Jesus Christ will fall off the wagon too, if you will. In other words, the most self-differentiated person that exists will eventually, as the anxiety goes through the roof, crumble, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And so that's what I think about with, so you talk about cutoff and fusion, and we tend to go one or the other, and people who are very undifferentiated go there really quickly, and people who are relatively more differentiated will get there eventually, because the anxiety gets so strong and they just can't hang on any longer.
Yeah, this is quoted directly from A Failure of Nerve, and this is exactly what we're talking about. It says, it is always easier to be the least mature member of a highly mature family than the most mature member of a highly regressed system. And this is what you're talking about, and so the more and more a system gets regressed and becomes more chronically anxietal, the harder and harder it becomes for somebody to step up. I'm not saying step up and do something, but that the curve is so much higher. They could still step up and do it, but to have the wherewithal, the resiliency to do it is very difficult.
And we're not taping any of this, so these are all good thoughts. I think about...
We're not taping this?
Are we taping it?
Yeah, I'm taping it.
Oh, I didn't know. I thought we were all just playing.
Oh, no, we're going.
Oh, well, I can't see why we're not.
No, great. These are good thoughts.
Yeah.
That's funny. I didn't know we were...
We'll peel back the curtain there a little bit.
Yeah,
John had no idea we were actually recording.
I just thought we were sharing thoughts.
As if we're not going off the cuff anyway.
Well, because I thought we should be taping this. This is good stuff.
Good thing we are. Wow.
Thank you, man. Just the quick peek behind the window. These guys take care of all the technology stuff. I just don't. I just show up and try to think and talk.
Deep thoughts right over here.
Yeah.
But think of two countries. I think of the response of Nazi Germany after World War I, a very anxious country, and they turn to a simple a guy who offers a simple message of restoration, and they just were drawn to it like a magnet. And then I think of our country in the Great Depression, and Franklin Roosevelt, who became someone who restored confidence in the country. And, politics aside regarding spending and whatnot, he was able to capture the hope, this hope for the American people. And so I think in a chronically anxious system, it's difficult for leaders to emerge and mature the system, because people are looking for, as you mentioned, that quick fix, and that's for sure. Wow, we were really taping that the whole time, huh?
The whole time.
Okay. All right.
So, any more thoughts about Charlottesville? That could be.
Yeah. Well, I said when we go back live, I want to talk about Charlottesville, and we were live when I said that.
Yeah.
So let me go back to Charlottesville from the weekend, and
I think all three of us have been, pondering over from a leadership perspective what's going on there.
Exactly true. And so I think about a chronically anxious system, and what feeds a chronically anxious system. And I think our last session we mentioned the SCARF model, and so you look at those letters of status, of certainty, of autonomy, of relatedness and fairness, those 5 words. And the individuals that went to Charlottesville, they went there to protest what they saw was an unjust action, that Robert E. Lee's statue, a park named after Robert E. Lee, was going to be changed to be named Emancipation Park, and they felt that was not right. And so they went to protest. And so think about individuals that are highly anxious and don't have those 5 elements. It just takes one event, counter protesters, to go from 0 to 60 like that. There's little thinking going on in an anxious system, lots of feeling, lots of reactivity. And so for one to take an automobile and drive it into a group of people and terribly killing someone, one has to ask the question, how do you get there? And how do I get there? And it's easy for me and others to sit back and point to others and say, that person, they're asking President Trump to come out and announce, his condemnation to their actions. And he called them their thugs. And I wondered why a president labeling someone a thug makes a difference. Because from an anxiety standpoint, I think all of us have the potential to act in ways that we would objectively say are pretty reprehensible. And so when I think about an anxious system, what does it look like? It looks like what happened in Charlottesville, and where individuals shout each other down. There's no thoughtful dialogue that's able to take place. Herding, you mentioned the idea of herding, of either you're for us or against us. Black and white thinking, the lack of playfulness. You mentioned earlier about Friedman talking about the reptilian brain. He goes on in the book to say, try this, he says. Try to have fun with your pet salamander. Kind of joke around with it a little bit, poke it on the side of the head and see what it does. It just looks at you like this and blinks its eyes. It has no playfulness at all.
He didn't do anything, by the way, because if you're just listening.
That's right. Thank you. But a dog, or that's a little bit more like the human species, you can have playfulness. So he says that in an anxious system, there's a lack of playfulness.
Yep.
Everything is deadly serious. And of course, the death this weekend of an individual is a terrible thing. But I'm wondering how we got as a society that everything is so serious. And that is a hallmark of an anxious society.
Yeah. So my question as we go to wrap up here, I think we could talk about anxiety forever. What do we do? How can we lower chronically anxious systems? What hope do we have for things like Charlottesville? What can we do individually for that?
I don't know how direct of an answer to your question this is, but I also think my answer ties back into your story as well. You were talking about how you had taken on characteristics that were arguably very good things to be. Someone who lowers the anxiety system, someone who never complains, someone just very good things, but because that's not who you were, they weren't values that like you yourself wanted to strive after. There was this inherent dissonance between the masks that you were portraying and who you were and wanted to be underneath all that.
Mm-hmm.
And so in that same way, we have this spectrum of solid self and is it called pseudo self? Is that the alternative?
Mm-hmm.
Pseudo self. And we look at asking for Trump to denounce these people, and it's because in some regards I think that might be, and I'm just spitballing here, that might be a level of affirmation that they are doing what they should be doing. They are riotous towards this action. They are angry that it happened, and they want affirmed that they have picked the right side and that they are against the people, even though that might not be truly what they want to efface when they are, maybe efface is the right word, what they want to stand for, like who they are as people. And so from that, we look at ourselves, and that's one of the bases of Bowen's theory is who are we as people and what do we stand for? And so we can look at that, and are we really on grounds that we want to fight for? Are we really people who are doing things because they are characteristic of the values that we want to tie our identity to?
What do you think, John?
Yeah, I think that in an anxious system, anxious systems need strong leadership to help the system become more mature, become more thoughtful. And so by an individual leader, I think about pronouns are important. I think in a fused society, in an anxious society, in a herding society, and herding, we're not talking about hurting as a T, but herding as in sheep. But in a herding society, the phrase we, the word we, I should say, is used a lot. This is what we should think. This is what we should do. I can remember listening to a radio program that said, how should Christians respond to this? And I called into the show and I said, I don't know that Christians should respond anyway, but this is how I see it, and you might see it differently. So I think the idea that individuals should think carefully what they believe and should be willing to share ideas that may be contrary to what the group thinks is right. Not for just to be a contrarian, but perhaps you see it differently, and expecting others to look at you sideways a bit. And but I think that's what leadership is. Otherwise, individuals continue on in lockstep with one another, and maturity doesn't happen. It's just groupthink. So I think leaders need to step aside, become distant enough. There's a lot of mosquitoes out here, by the way. Become distant enough to be able to lead, but close enough to influence people.
Yeah. Not to bring like a playfulness into it, but if you are watching this, I'm having chronic anxiety over these stupid mosquitoes.
There's a lot of mosquitoes, yes.
I'm having many what ifs.
Yes.
If it stings, if it gets me on the neck or something, Yeah, as far as, what do you do? It's that self-differentiation. And there's a point where you do step up, right? I mean, you have to step for what you believe in, but that is in a non-anxious way. So there's a place and time for feeling, but there's also a place and time for logic and thinking about factual things. I am not saying that, somebody passes away from some injustice, we need to bring logic to that right away. There's a time for mourning and showing emotion with emotion, but then there is a time in which you help people, including yourself, de-escalate emotionally to come to a logical place to say, okay, now what truly is the matter here? What is going on behind the scenes with others as well as myself, and what can we do with that? And so that's going into gray areas and not painting it black and white and putting these people here and those people there. And so that is a lot of work, and it takes a lot of time to do that. But I think we have a society that can do that. And so, but you can individually take responsibility over these issues and say, instead of quick blame, displacement, and I'm not a part of that, if you start to take some responsibility and say, you know what, but I'm responsible to have some sort of proper reaction to it. And how can I do that? And how can I be inquisitive and curious of other people to understand what's truly going on behind the scenes, and why people are having such quick and sharp reactions to it? Look, when Charlottesville happened, I was angry. I think we're probably all angry. And there's a time for that, emotional time. I don't. There's no issue with that. It's just, what are we doing next with that, and what are we going to do with that? And so that's for another discussion another time, but at least I hope that we give you some sort of building blocks of what anxiety looks like with chronic anxiety and acute anxiety, and how to deal with those things. What does it look like in our world? And it's fundamental to every system that we're in. And so understanding and seeing it is going to be helpful to your own leadership, just over your own self, but any system that you're in. Any closing thoughts, gentlemen?
Yeah, I'll just say, before we get truly eaten alive, I have probably 8 mosquito bites and counting. What we're speaking of here and what we'll speak of in the future hopefully gives you a framework to see things differently than you thought of before. We don't give answers. Bowen theory doesn't offer solutions. It does offer a way of seeing things differently, and then thinking about things differently, and then maybe making a different choice. That's what I found to be the most helpful with it.
Yeah, those what-if questions, those what, whys, and hows, not the do-yous, nothing with a yes-no answer.
Well, it has been great discussion, and obviously this is a two-parter, so we appreciate you sticking around and listening to this whole thing. We love to talk about this, and hopefully that's been something that's been good for you to listen to. And you can get a hold of us on Facebook. You can also shoot us an email at theofpodcast@gmail.com. And, we're also on YouTube. So any thoughts you have about this, or any questions that you have, I mean, we're not shying away from talking about big issue things, civil rights types things, anything that comes out. We are free to talk about those things, and in a lens of this leadership, it just makes things a little bit clear. I think, at least from my own personal standpoint, helps me understand a little bit of why this is happening, and which can be helpful in a lot of different directions. Now, that does lead to, like, what's the next step? There's fundamentally lots of different steps that need to be taken if we're going to Charlottesville and civil rights. I mean, there's lots to handle there. But each one of us has a responsibility and an opportunity to do something about it. And so I encourage everybody to do that. And I also encourage you to listen to us again. So thanks for having us in your home or your car or
Earbuds.
Yeah, whatever's happening.
Yep.
Yeah.
Wherever.
Yep. So I'm Alex.
John.
I'm Zach.
And we'll catch you next time.
Thank you.
Bye.